There we go. All right, my name is Amelia Ascione, and I'm a third-year PhD student at NAU. Today, I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on with Mike Bland, where we've been modeling the viscous relaxation of craters on Europa. Now, viscous relaxation is the gradual flow of material that naturally occurs to reduce stresses created by topography. So after an impact crater is formed, there's a significant amount of stress in the near subsurface that eventually relaxes over millions to billions of years, depending on the material properties of the impact site. And when this occurs, you'll commonly see the updoming of the crater floor, which is a hallmark of viscous relaxation. And this occurs because relaxation is wavelength dependent, meaning that longer wavelength topography, like a crater floor, will relax more than shorter wavelength topography, like a crater rim. And you can see that effect pretty clearly in this image of Marius Reggio on Ganymede, which hosts several shallow, relaxed craters with semi-preserved rims nearby deep, unrelaxed craters. This figure from McKinnon et al. Is a good example of how relaxation is temperature dependent. In this study, they modeled crater relaxation on Pluto as a function of heat flux. And you can see in the topmost panel that when a low heat flux is applied, there is very little relaxation. But then as they increased the heat fluxes in subsequent simulations, they saw more and more depth reduction. Now, since relaxation is highly dependent on the temperature and viscosity structure of the body, we commonly see relaxed craters on icy bodies since the viscosity of ice is lower than that of rock. And we can expect that the rate of relaxation is higher on icy bodies with warmer ice shelves. Now, there have been a number of recent studies on viscous relaxation's effect on icy bodies like Ganymede, Enceladus, Ariel, Pluto, and several others, but there's relatively little quantitative research on its effect on Europa. And this is likely due to two basic assumptions. One, that viscous relaxation occurs over very long timescales, and two, that Europa's surface is relatively young, about 40 to 90 million years old. So this has led to the assumption that viscous relaxation couldn't have had enough time to significantly reduce crater depths. To test this assumption, we modeled relaxation scenarios for an existing crater, Cilix, due to DTM availability and its relatively simple topography. Cilix is a shallow 18-kilometer complex crater with a central peak and a dark halo of material surrounding it, which might imply a relatively young age of 40 or 50 million years or so. So we first took a profile of Cilix's depth so that we'd have a present-day crater profile to compare our relaxation results to. However, since the model that we're using can only forward model from an initial crater profile, we needed to extrapolate what a fresh Cilix crater might have looked like 40 million years ago, which is our conservative estimate of Cilix's age. Now, there's no topographic data on fresh mid-sized craters on Europa, but there is ample information on fresh crater morphometries on Ganymede. So we used measurements of their depths from Bray et al. And scaling laws to construct our fresh Cilix crater shown on the bottom here. And when we overlay these two profiles, we see that a depth reduction nearing 95% is needed to relax our initial modeled crater to Cilix's current apparent depth. Now, we're also keeping in mind that several studies have shown that impacts into warmer ice shells like Europa's produce shallower initial craters. So in the coming months, we intend to run some simulations with shallower initial profiles as well. Now, to model relaxation, we are using Tecton, which is a finite element model that essentially breaks down the surface and subsurface into discrete elements connected by nodes, as illustrated here. In this case, we have created a 50 by 50 kilometer mesh that extends slightly more than 5 times the crater radius to reduce bottom and edge effects. We also implemented a horizontal resolution of 1 kilometer and a vertical resolution ranging from 100 meters near the surface to 600 meters bending. We then set the material properties for each element to be consistent with the rheological properties of water ice 1H as listed here. Now for the rheology, we first calculated the Newtonian viscosities for each element for a range of surface temperatures and heat fluxes, and then implemented a unique layered viscosity structure for each simulation. And we started with a Newtonian rheology just to get a conservative estimate of relaxation extent and to test our modeling approach. And then we ran the same suite of simulations under a non-Newtonian grain boundary sliding dominated rheology. Now, grain boundary sliding, or GBS, is an intergranular process in which deformation occurs along grain boundaries. And depending on the grain size distribution and stress state within the ice shell, it could be the dominant deformation mechanism here. So in total, so far we have modeled 60 relaxation scenarios. We implemented 3 surface temperatures and 10 heat fluxes for each surface temperature. This included more conservative, modern estimates of surface temperature and heat flux, as well as some significantly higher values that might represent past conditions. For context, it's estimated that the surface temperature at Europa's equator, where Silix is about 100 Kelvin. And while there's still much debate around the heat flux at Europa's surface, recent studies suggest that anywhere from 30 to 80 milliwatts per square meter is a reasonable assumption. Now, we're also taking into account the possibility of transient elevated heat pulses in Europa's past. These have been proposed by thermal orbital evolution models, which suggest that Europa has experienced periods of oscillating eccentricity from gravitational interactions with Io and Ganymede. And these peaks in eccentricity would increase the amplitude of tidal forces acting on Europa, causing pulses of high heat production and in turn higher relaxation rates. Now I'll start with the results of our Newtonian simulations. As expected, relaxation fraction increases with surface temperature and heat flux. Interestingly though, we saw limited to moderate depth reduction within 40 million years. This figure shows quantitatively how much relaxation we saw in each of these simulations. At a conservative surface temperature of 100 Kelvin and heat fluxes of 30 and 80 milliwatts per square meter, there was less than 10% depth reduction. Even at a surface temperature of 110 Kelvin, we did not get depth reductions exceeding 15% if we invoke those modern heat fluxes. And it's not until we assume significantly higher heat fluxes that we begin to see depth reductions exceeding 30%. Now, let's compare this to the results of our non-Newtonian simulations where grain boundary sliding was the dominant deformation mechanism. As expected, the GBS simulations allowed for more relaxation. This is because with a GBS rheology, viscosity decreases with increasing stress. So the highest stress regions of the crater would flow faster, unlike the uniform flow assumed under a Newtonian rheology. Now at modern surface temperatures and heat fluxes, we see slightly more relaxation, up to 14% under the GBS rheology. But if we assume that sometime in Europa's past, it has experienced heat fluxes anywhere from 120 to 240 milliwatts per square meter, we begin seeing about 15% more relaxation on average compared to our Newtonian simulations. And in almost every case, we're seeing at least 30% relaxation, with the highest heat simulations resulting in up to 70% depth reduction. So if we assume that grain boundary sliding is the dominant deformation mechanism in the crust, and that Europa has experienced high heat events, then it's very likely that viscous relaxation has played a significant role in post-impact shallowing. However, we can't be certain that GBS is the dominant deformation mechanism here, as this depends on things like grain size and impurity content within the crust, which are currently not well constrained for Europa. A recent study found that a particulate volume fraction as small as 6% may completely inhibit grain boundary sliding. Now, Europa's ice shell likely contains some small fraction of non-ice components, such as salts and radiolytic products. And if this fraction is large enough, it could inhibit the grain boundary sliding process. And for this reason, we're also going to run the same suite of simulations under a dislocation creep dominated rheology, because dislocation creep is an intragranular process that should not be as affected by the presence of intergranular particles. So to summarize, we found that limited relaxation occurs under modern heat fluxes and surface temperatures, and it's not until we invoke elevated thermal conditions that we begin to see significant depth reductions. In particular, our grain boundary sliding simulations resulted in about 12% more relaxation on average and reached depth reductions ranging from 40 to 70% relaxation under moderately elevated thermal conditions. It's important to note, however, that none of our simulations resulted in the near complete flattening of the impact crater. So this tells us that regardless of any potential elevated heat pulses, that other processes like shallow formation, sublimation erosion, and isostatic adjustment can collectively contribute to a significant fraction of post-impact shallowing on Europa. Thank you. Questions?
Well, we have time for a few questions from anyone in the room or online.
Sierra Ferguson from Southwest Research. For when you're taking the topographic profile across Celix, is that more of an average topographic profile, or is that just that single line?
Yeah, that's that single line.
Okay.
I did it in that orientation because the DTM actually cuts off near the top, so that was just the best area to do it.
Gotcha.
Michelle Bergoff-Fleury. Yeah, I was curious. I mean, you talked about the fact that if the shell was warmer and everything, you'd get a less topography to begin with, and you want to test that. I know too that this probably isn't a big enough crater for that, but they talk about, even punch through. Is that something you guys are considering as well?
I think given the size of this crater, it probably didn't penetrate the ice shell.
Yeah.
Of course, it depends on if in the past the ice shell was thinner due to higher heat conditions, then possibly, but I would say probably not for this crater.
Do we know what causes the dark yellow?
I think that's just maybe a space weather thing.
Okay.